My name is Anneliese Vogel, and I was 19 when the war truly touched my life. I grew up in a quiet village nestled in the rolling hills of Bavaria, Germany, the kind of place where mornings smelled of fresh bread and the air was always tinged with the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. My father, a stern yet loving man, taught history and strategy, instilling in me an early understanding of the value of freedom and the weight of responsibility. He would often take me and my older brother into the woods, pointing out the ways of tracking, observing, and thinking several steps ahead, a child's game that later revealed its purpose in survival. My mother, gentle but unwavering, was the anchor of our small household. She taught me how to read the signs of the land, how to care for animals, and how to tend a wound or prepare a simple meal when resources were scarce. From her, I learned patience, resilience, and the quiet courage that often goes unnoticed but sustains one through unimaginable trials. My older brother Lucas was my closest companion in those early years. We shared secret paths through the woods, built hidden hideouts, and imagined ourselves as explorers and protectors of our home. Together, we dreamed freely, blissfully unaware that the shadows of conflict were creeping ever closer. Though our family was ordinary, our home was filled with lessons of honor, courage, and loyalty. I was a child of a quiet village, yet even then I felt a pull towards something greater, a sense that life demanded more than comfort, that one must sometimes rise in the face of injustice. Little did I know the innocence of those mornings would soon be shattered, and I would be called upon to test the very courage that my parents had so carefully nurtured. I remember the mornings in our village with a clarity that even war could not erase. The sun would rise over the hills, casting golden light on the cobblestone streets, and the smell of freshly baked bread from my mother's oven would mingle with the earthy scent of dew-soaked fields. I spent my days running barefoot through the meadows, chasing Lucas as we imagined ourselves as guardians of the forest, defending invisible borders against unseen invaders. Life was simple, filled with the quiet joys of childhood, the laughter of neighbors, the ringing of church bells on Sundays, the distant songs of birds in the orchards. Our home was a small, sturdy house of timber and stone warm in the winter and open to the summer breeze. I learned early the rhythm of tending to animals, helping my mother gather eggs from the chicken coop or mend broken tools alongside my father in the workshop. Each task, no matter how mundane, carried with it lessons of patience, responsibility, and diligence. I understood even then that every effort mattered, that care and attention could mean survival even in a world that seemed untouched by war. The village itself was a tapestry of human stories. Elderly neighbors shared tales of past struggles while children my age played carefree in the streets, oblivious to the storm approaching beyond our hills. Festivals brought everyone together, harvest dances, music echoing through the fields, and a sense of unity that seemed unbreakable. It was in these moments that I first sensed the strength of community, the invisible bonds that held us together and gave courage in the face of hardship. Yet, beneath the laughter and daily routines, there was a quiet tension. Whispers of political change, of soldiers marching closer, and of neighbors disappearing began to thread through the air. Even as a child, I felt the undercurrent of fear and uncertainty, though it mingled with curiosity and the stubborn hope that life in its simple rhythms would continue. Little did I know those early lessons of homework and community would become the foundation of resilience I would rely on in the dark days ahead. As I grew older, the world outside our village began to change in ways that seemed both distant and frighteningly close. The newspapers my father would sometimes read aloud spoke of marches, speeches, and decrees, words that felt heavy with consequences I could barely comprehend. Soldiers in crisp uniforms began to appear more often on the roads, their boots pounding a rhythm that seemed to echo through the cobblestone streets. Our village, once a quiet haven, was slowly being drawn into the tide of a war whose reach we had once thought impossible. Neighbors whispered about loyalty and betrayal, some quietly supporting resistance movements, while others bowed to the authority of the occupying forces. The tension was subtle at first, a glance too long a word, spoken in caution, but it grew heavier with each passing month. Rationing of food and supplies began, and the once bustling markets felt muted as if the very air carried an unspoken warning. Even the forests and fields we had played in were no longer untouched. Soldiers patrolled the outskirts, and the sense of freedom that had defined my childhood began to erode. I observed the fear and the courage of the people around me. My father spoke in hushed tones about strategy and the importance of remaining vigilant, emphasizing that knowledge and preparation could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. My mother, while continuing her daily routines, would glance out the window with worry, noting the strangers who arrived with heavy boots and harsher intentions. And yet, amidst the tension, the village clung to small acts of resistance, secret meetings, whispered plans, and coded messages passed quietly from hand to hand. It was in these days that I first understood the fragile balance between normalcy and danger. I realized that life could change in a heartbeat, and that courage was not only about grand gestures, but about the quiet determination to protect one's family, one's neighbors, and the values that defined us. Even as a young girl, I began to feel the stirrings of a purpose greater than myself, a call to action that would soon demand everything I had and more. The first cracks in our peaceful village life appeared quietly, almost imperceptibly, but once they were visible, nothing could hide them. I remember the day a neighbor's home was raided. Smoke curled from the roof as soldiers searched each room, overturning furniture and tearing apart the modest belongings of a family who had done nothing to provoke them. The cries of children and the muffled sobs of adults lingered in the air long after the soldiers had left, leaving behind a silence heavier than any words could convey. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding, feeling a strange mix of fear, anger, and helplessness. It was the first time I truly understood that innocence could be ripped away in an instant, that the world could change overnight. That day, the forest paths where Lucas and I had played felt less safe. The fields where we ran freely now seemed vulnerable, and even our sturdy home felt fragile under the shadow of the occupying forces. Whispers of disappearances and punishments began circulating. The village elders spoke in hushed tones about neighbors who had vanished, about punishments imposed for acts of defiance, and about the small but brave resistance cells that were forming in secret. The stories terrified me, yet they also sparked a strange resolve within me. I realized that if we did nothing, our village, our families, and everything we held dear could be lost. And if we acted even in small ways, we might reclaim some measure of control, some fragment of hope. In the quiet moments at night, I thought about what my parents had taught me: patience, vigilance, courage, and responsibility. I felt the stirrings of determination, an awareness that I could no longer remain a passive observer. The shadow of conflict had crept into every corner of our village, and with it, the call to step forward, to fight, and to protect had begun to echo within me. As the days passed, the tension in our village only grew, and the once familiar streets began to feel like a labyrinth of uncertainty. Soldiers patrolled more frequently, their boots heavy on the cobblestones, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Rumors of reprisals, of families punished for the smallest acts of defiance, traveled quickly from one household to the next. The quiet, predictable rhythms of life that I had cherished were now replaced with a constant gnawing unease. I felt a strange mixture of fear and determination stirring within me. Every glance at the distant hills, every echo of marching feet reminded me that our lives could change in an instant. Yet alongside the fear, there was a growing resolve, a whisper that perhaps courage was not just about daring acts on the battlefield, but also about standing firm in the face of oppression, even in small, unnoticed ways. My parents' lessons echoed in my mind more than ever. My father's words about vigilance and strategy, my mother's teachings of resilience and quiet strength, they were no longer abstract ideals, they were guides for survival and action. I began to understand that the coming days would demand choices that could not be reversed, that bravery would be tested not in comfort, but in danger, and that loyalty to family, friends, and one's principles might require a sacrifice beyond anything I had yet imagined. And so in the quiet of my room, I made a silent vow. When the time came, I would step beyond the safety of my childhood, beyond the comfort of home, and face the storm that was approaching. I did not yet know what challenges awaited me, whether I would endure, stumble, or survive, but I knew that the path forward would demand courage, cunning, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals that had been instilled in me since my earliest days. The war was coming, and I could no longer remain a bystander. The day I officially joined the resistance, I felt a mixture of fear, excitement, and the faintest spark of pride. The forest clearing where we met our unit smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the faces around me were a mosaic of determination and uncertainty. Men and women of all ages, from teenagers barely older than me to seasoned veterans with lined faces, gathered in cautious circles, sizing each other up, sharing silent nods of acknowledgement. Each one carried the weight of personal loss and the quiet fire of rebellion in their eyes. Our first lessons were simple, yet unforgiving. We learned to move silently through the woods, to recognize the smallest disturbances in the underbrush, and to mark trails with discrete signs that only those trained could decipher. We practiced hiding in plain sight, blending with the shadows of trees and rocks, always aware that discovery could mean capture or death. I struggled at first, my hands trembling as I held the rifle, my heart racing at every crackle in the leaves, every distant footfall. Yet with each step and repeated exercise, a strange confidence began to grow. I was learning not just to survive, but to see the world through the lens of strategy and vigilance. The instructors, some older veterans and some former soldiers who had turned against the occupiers, were strict yet patient. They corrected our mistakes without malice, emphasizing that hesitation could cost lives not just our own, but those of our comrades and the innocent villagers we swore to protect. Firearm drills, setting simple traps, and silent communication exercises became routine, but they were never abstract. Every skill had purpose, every lesson carried weight, and every failure was a stark reminder of the stakes. By the end of my first week, I began to feel a sense of belonging. The fear that had gripped me on the first day was tempered by camaraderie and shared purpose. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And in that forest clearing, among those who had chosen to stand against tyranny, I took my first true step into the war, not as a frightened girl from a quiet village, but as a member of a force determined to resist, to survive, and to fight for the freedom of those who could not defend themselves. The morning I left my village, the sky was gray and heavy, as if it mirrored the knot of anxiety in my stomach. My mother had prepared a small bundle of food, bread, cheese, and dried fruit wrapped carefully in cloth. She handed it to me with trembling hands, her eyes wet but resolute. "Take care of yourself, Anneliese," she whispered. "Be brave, but remember who you are and what you are fighting for." I clutched the bundle, feeling the weight of her love and the fragility of the life I was leaving behind. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, a stern mask on his face that barely concealed his worry. He gave me a small satchel containing maps, a compass, and a notebook. "Observe," he said simply. "Think ahead. Measure every step. Your mind can save your life even when your body cannot." His words, calm yet firm, echoed in my mind. I understood then that the lessons he had taught me as a child, the tracking, the patience, the strategy, were no longer games. They were tools for survival. My older brother Lucas walked with me to the edge of the forest. He said little, his jaw tight, his hands clenched, but the silence between us spoke volumes. We had spent our childhood exploring these woods, running along hidden paths and dreaming of adventures. Now those same paths would be the first test of my courage. I felt a pang of fear and a surge of determination at the same time. The war had come to our door, and I could no longer be a bystander. As I stepped away from the village, the familiar sights blurred under the morning mist. Each footfall felt heavier, carrying with it the gravity of what lay ahead. I turned back once, catching a glimpse of my parents' faces framed in the doorway, their eyes a mixture of pride, fear, and hope. I whispered a silent promise to them to protect myself, to survive, and to honor everything they had taught me. That day marked the end of my childhood and the beginning of a journey into a world where every choice, every movement, and every breath could mean life or death. The first mission assigned to me was Deceptively Simple Scout, a nearby supply route used by the occupying forces, and deliver the information back to our unit. As I crept through the underbrush, the early morning mist clinging to my clothes, every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set my heart racing. My hands clutched the notebook my father had given me, the pencil ready to mark every observation, every detail, every movement of the enemy. My fellow recruits accompanied me in silence, their faces etched with concentration. Some were older, with hardened eyes and hands that had known the weight of rifles and loss. Others, like me, were barely adults, learning quickly that the forest could be as deadly as the enemy it concealed. Our guide whispered instructions. "Move slowly, keep low, count the trucks, note the guards' patterns. And remember, if discovered, retreat immediately." Time seemed to stretch unnaturally as we approached the road. I crouched behind a fallen log, barely daring to breathe. A convoy of vehicles rumbled past their engines loud enough to shake the ground beneath me. I counted each truck, scribbling notes in the damp notebook, my fingers trembling despite my best efforts to remain steady. Every glance upward revealed watchful eyes, every shadow could hide danger. My pulse raced, my stomach knotted with fear, but I forced myself to focus, to observe, to survive. When the convoy finally passed, we retraced our steps through the forest, careful to leave no trace of our presence. The tension remained. One false move could undo everything. Yet despite the fear, there was a spark of exhilaration. I realized that I could do this. I could navigate the unknown act with precision and contribute to something larger than myself. The mission had tested my nerves, my focus, and my courage, but it had also taught me that survival required more than bravery. It required strategy, patience, and trust in those around me. Back at the unit, we shared our observations with the commanders who nodded and incorporated our findings into their plans. For the first time, I felt the tangible impact of my actions, however small. That night, as I lay beneath the canopy of the forest, I understood that this was only the beginning. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and I was now part of it. The forests and hills of Bavaria were not merely a backdrop for our small acts of defiance. They were part of a larger, brutal theater of war. By the autumn of 1944, the German army was stretched thin, their supply lines vulnerable as the Allied forces pressed from the west, and partisan groups increased in number and audacity. Every convoy we observed, every foot patrol we avoided, existed within the shifting tides of a continent in turmoil. Our missions, though minor in scope, were threads in the broader tapestry of resistance, a tapestry that was constantly being rewritten by strategy, luck, and sacrifice. Local villages like mine bore the weight of occupation. Reprisals against civilians were common when supplies were sabotaged or information leaked. Rumors of families deported or executed for even the smallest infractions circulated in whispers, creating an atmosphere of fear that pressed heavily on our shoulders. It was this reality that made each step through the forest so perilous. A single miscalculation could unravel months of careful observation, and the consequences could extend far beyond the individual. The war was not an abstract concept for us. It was a daily presence tangible in every glance at the soldiers' watchtowers, every distant echo of gunfire, every news fragment that reached the village. The knowledge of these broader events added weight to our small actions. As I mapped the supply routes, I considered how the disruption of one convoy could ripple outward, delaying ammunition, food, or reinforcements for troops already stretched thin. My mind, once occupied only with immediate survival, now had to account for strategy, timing, and the cascading effects of each choice. The resistance was a network delicate and fragile, yet potent when coordinated. Each observation I recorded, each hidden trail I marked became a small, vital contribution to the larger struggle unfolding across Europe. By the time I returned from that mission, I carried with me not only the satisfaction of success, but also a new understanding of the war's vastness and complexity. The conflict was everywhere, touching even the quietest villages, infiltrating the forests, shaping every decision. The fear I felt was tempered by comprehension. Courage was no longer just an instinct, it was informed, deliberate, and intimately connected to the broader battle for freedom and survival. Returning to the forest camp after my first mission, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The adrenaline that had kept me sharp during the scouting run slowly ebbed, leaving space for reflection. I thought about every movement, every decision, and every moment of fear I had felt. I realized that this war demanded more than courage. It demanded awareness, adaptability, and an understanding of the subtle rhythms of danger. I had survived, yes, but survival alone was not enough. I needed to learn to grow, to become part of something larger than myself. The instructors noticed the change in me, the way I observed my surroundings, with heightened attention, the way I considered strategy, even in small decisions. I began to internalize lessons from each encounter, how to move silently, how to anticipate an enemy's response, and how to trust my instincts while remaining disciplined. Mistakes no longer filled me with paralyzing fear. They became opportunities to learn, to adjust, and to prepare for the unknown. Slowly, the forest transformed from a place of trepidation into a training ground for resilience and courage. Beyond skills, I grappled with the emotional weight of this life. Every mission reminded me that the stakes were real, that missteps could cost lives, that my choices affected not only my survival, but the safety of my comrades and the villagers we aimed to protect. I began to see the subtle balance between fear and focus, between instinct and reason. Courage, I learned, was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act thoughtfully despite it. And in those quiet moments after a long day of training and observation, I felt the slow emergence of confidence tempered by humility and the sobering understanding of what was at stake. I also reflected on the bonds forming within our small unit. Shared struggles and whispered encouragements created trust, a fragile but vital lifeline in a world where betrayal or error could mean death. I realized that adaptation was not just about mastering tactics. It was about learning to live and think as part of a team, to rely on others and to give them reason to rely on me. The forest, the missions, and the ever-present threat of discovery were shaping me not into the child who had once roamed carefree through the village meadows, but into a fighter, a strategist, and above all, someone determined to survive and protect what mattered most. By the end of those first weeks, I no longer felt like an outsider in the resistance. The fear remained, of course, but it had been transformed into focus and determination. I had taken the first true steps into the life of a duelist against oppression, and I was beginning to understand the sacrifices, the responsibilities, and the resilience that this path demanded. The morning of our first major engagement arrived with a heavy fog that clung to the forest like a shroud. I crouched low beside the others, heart hammering, every sense stretched to its limit. The distant rumble of trucks and the harsh cadence of boots on the dirt road announced the arrival of the occupying forces. My hands gripped the rifle with white-knuckled intensity, and I could feel the tension radiating from my comrades, men and women who had become my makeshift family in these past weeks. The battle erupted suddenly. Explosions shattered the fragile calm, sending birds screaming into the sky and splintering the stillness of the forest. Bullets whistled past striking trees, kicking up clouds of earth and debris around us. My first instinct was to duck, to stay hidden, yet training surged through me, reminding me to observe, to move, to act. I relayed messages between positions, warned a fellow recruit of an approaching patrol, and helped drag a wounded comrade into the shadows. Each task, each small action was a thread in the tapestry of survival, delicate yet essential. I watched in horror as a close friend fell, struck down by a single burst of gunfire. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the sounds of battle momentarily muffled by the weight of loss. Pain, disbelief, and a surge of anger swept through me simultaneously. But there was no time to grieve. The enemy was advancing, and we had to adapt or perish. Every footstep, every whispered command, every careful glance mattered. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were life and death, immediate and unforgiving. Amid the chaos, I felt a strange clarity. Fear had sharpened my senses, honed my decisions. I moved swiftly, quietly, instinctively, each action a balance between survival and the protection of those around me. The forest became both ally and adversary. The trees provided cover, but the uneven terrain and thick underbrush slowed us, making every movement calculated and perilous. When the battle finally ebbed, silence fell over the forest like a weight. Smoke lingered, the scent of burnt earth, and gunpowder thick in the air. Bodies of the fallen and wounded lay scattered, a grim testament to the cost of resistance. I sank to the ground, trembling heart still racing, mourning my friends, and yet feeling a surge of grim determination. This was only the beginning. The war had revealed its brutality in full, and I knew that every step forward would demand courage, cunning, and endurance beyond anything I had yet imagined. The aftermath of the battle was a haunting silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the occasional crackle of burning debris. I moved carefully among the fallen, my stomach churning, eyes wide with disbelief. Friends I had laughed with, trained alongside, and confided in were now motionless, some forever. The forest, once a place of solace and secrecy, had become a graveyard of broken trees, scorched earth, and shattered lives. The scent of smoke and blood lingered, clinging to my clothes, searing itself into my memory. Each body I passed carried a story, a fragment of the life we had shared before the war claimed them. I knelt beside one young man, his hand cold in mine eyes, still open in a frozen stare. Tears threatened, but there was no time, no luxury for mourning. The others needed me, and survival demanded focus. Still, the weight of grief pressed down, making every step heavy, every breath laborious. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a mixture of fear, sorrow, and anger that seemed to sap my strength even as adrenaline kept me moving. I also saw the villagers' suffering reflected in the battlefield. Homes had been burned, livestock slaughtered, and innocent people caught in the crossfire. The cost of resistance was not only measured in our blood, but in theirs as well. The faces of frightened children and grieving parents haunted me, a reminder of the responsibility I carried beyond my own survival. Every mission, every risk, every decision now bore the weight of human lives. Despite the despair, I noticed the quiet acts of courage around me. A fellow recruit dragged a severely wounded comrade to cover, another whispered instructions to those too stunned to move. Amid the carnage, the threads of trust and loyalty that bound our small unit together shone brightest. I clung to that, realizing that in this chaos, unity and mutual care were as vital as any weapon. As dusk fell over the scarred forest, I sank to the ground, shaking from fatigue and grief. The battle had stripped away any remaining illusions I held about war. It was merciless, chaotic, and cruel. Yet within me, a fierce resolve was taking root. I had survived this first test, but the losses etched into my soul would remain, shaping every choice, every step, and every act of defiance in the battles yet to come. During a subsequent skirmish, I felt the searing pain before I fully realized what had happened. A stray bullet grazed my shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh, leaving me stunned and momentarily paralyzed by shock. The forest, usually my ally, seemed suddenly treacherous, every shadow hiding a potential enemy. My comrades shouted for me to move, their voices distant yet urgent. I forced myself to focus, suppressing the wave of panic threatening to drown me, and followed their lead to a shallow ditch that offered some cover. Blood slicked my sleeve, my heart pounded, and every movement sent jolts of agony through my arm. The fear was raw and immediate. I knew that if I faltered, if the enemy spotted me, capture or death was inevitable. Yet training and instinct guided me. I applied a quick tourniquet from my kit, breathed deeply, and allowed the adrenaline to steady my shaking hands. Pain and fear coexisted with a strange clarity. Survival demanded action, and I could not afford hesitation. In the chaos, I caught sight of enemy patrols closing in, their shouts cutting through the misty morning air. For a moment, the thought of capture gripped me like ice. Being taken prisoner meant not only suffering, but the potential exposure of our hidden operations and the danger it posed to my fellow resistance members. My mind raced through every lesson from training, every escape tactic, every whispered instruction from our guides. I chose the path that kept me out of sight, crawling over roots and underbrush, feeling the sting of blood on leaves and soil. Even as I retreated, I grappled with the weight of guilt and fear. Would my injury slow the unit? Could I still be trusted to contribute? The questions gnawed at me, yet amidst the fear, a steely determination began to form. I would not allow pain or the threat of capture to break my resolve. Each step was deliberate, measured a small victory against the terror threatening to consume me. By the time I reached relative safety, I was battered, bleeding, and trembling, but alive. And in that survival, I found a new understanding. Fear was an inevitable companion, but courage was the decision to act in spite of it. The battlefield was no longer a distant concept. It was the air I breathed, the mud I crawled through, and the cries of the fallen that haunted every moment. With each mission, I grappled not only with fear, but with the weight of moral decisions. The enemy soldiers were not monsters in my mind. They were young men, many barely older than me, carrying out orders under pressures I could only guess at. Could I justify taking their lives to protect my village, my comrades, and the ideals we fought for? The question gnawed at me during quiet moments, leaving me restless and contemplative. I remembered the faces of villagers caught in crossfire, children clinging to their mothers, and elderly villagers pleading for mercy. Every choice carried consequence. When we sabotaged a supply convoy or ambushed a patrol, I felt a mixture of satisfaction for our success and a pang of guilt for the potential repercussions. The line between right and wrong blurred, and the black and white ideals of childhood faded into the gray of necessity and survival. Yet it was through these moral struggles that I began to understand the true nature of courage. It was not simply the act of fighting, nor the absence of fear, but the willingness to make decisions weighed with conscience and to accept the consequences. Every hesitation, every doubt, every question of ethics strengthened my resolve to act thoughtfully, not impulsively. I learned to measure my actions not only by immediate survival, but by their impact on those around me, comrades, villagers, and even the enemy in the respect I could afford. These experiences shifted my perception of war entirely. It was no longer a series of tactical maneuvers or distant headlines. It was a test of humanity, a crucible that revealed both the capacity for courage and the fragility of conscience. I began to see myself not just as a soldier or a duelist against oppression, but as a guardian of values carrying the lessons of my family, my village, and my own heart into every choice. The battlefield demanded more than skill. It demanded reflection, empathy, and the strength to act rightly even when the cost was immeasurable. The environment around us became an unrelenting character in its own right, shaping every choice, every breath, and every heartbeat. The forest that had once offered concealment now felt alive with threat branches, snapping under unseen footsteps, leaves rustling with the approach of enemy patrols and fog. clinging to the undergrowth, distorting distances, and blurring familiar paths. The weather added its own torment. Cold rain soaking our uniforms, turning paths into slick mud, winds carrying the distant echo of gunfire, clouds blotting out the sun, leaving the forest in a shadowed, oppressive gray. Every element heightened the tension, amplifying both fear and focus. The sights and sounds of the battlefield left indelible impressions on my mind. Charred trees, splintered homes, and the remnants of supply lines destroyed by our actions formed a landscape of chaos and devastation. The smoke of burning villages mingled with the metallic scent of blood, creating a haze that pressed on my lungs and memories alike. Even the smallest details, the tremor of a dying bird, the flash of a soldier's uniform through the fog, triggered rapid calculations, instinctive decisions, and the pulse-quickening awareness of vulnerability. Emotionally, the environment intensified every feeling I carried. Fear became sharper in the oppressive darkness, sorrow heavier when surrounded by the ruined remnants of life we were fighting to protect. Yet paradoxically, these same conditions fostered moments of clarity and resilience. The mist that concealed our movements gave us advantage. The dense underbrush provided hiding places. The unpredictable terrain forced adaptability and teamwork. I learned to read the subtle cues of nature as carefully as the behavior of the enemy, discovering that survival required harmony with the environment as much as courage. By the time the day drew to a close and the smoke lifted enough for a grim survey of our surroundings, I understood that the forest, the weather, and the chaos of war were inseparable from my experience. They had not merely tested my physical abilities, but shaped my emotional and psychological responses, teaching me patience, vigilance, and the weight of responsibility. In every shadow, every rustle, every shift in the wind, I felt the full measure of the war's reality, and in facing it, I became increasingly aware of my capacity to endure, adapt, and survive. The days following the battle felt as though the forest itself had shifted into a realm of shadows and whispers. My shoulders still throbbed from the graze of a bullet, and every step reminded me of the ache that lingered beneath the fabric of my uniform. Fatigue clung to my body like a second skin. Sleep was fitful, broken by nightmares of fallen comrades, the echo of gunfire, and the acrid scent of smoke that seemed to haunt even the quiet moments. Each blink, each breath carried the weight of what I had survived and what I had witnessed. The psychological toll was heavier than any physical wound. I found myself replaying the events over and over, analyzing my decisions, my movements, questioning whether I could have acted differently, saved someone else, or prevented a loss. The faces of my fallen friends, so vivid and so alive in memory, haunted every shadow, every corner of the forest, and even the quiet evenings when the camp was still. I felt the acute sting of survivor's guilt, a persistent ache that reminded me I had lived while others had perished. It was an unrelenting companion, whispering doubts and fears that threatened to erode my resolve. Even simple tasks became exercises in concentration and endurance. The act of moving silently, of preparing food, of tending minor injuries, now demanded focus beyond the usual. My body was sore, my mind tense, and the constant vigilance required to avoid enemy patrols left no room for respite. Yet, amidst the pain and fear, there was a spark, a recognition that endurance itself could become a source of strength. I began to understand that survival was not simply avoiding death, but embracing the capacity to carry on, to act with precision, and to protect those around me, despite the toll it took on both body and spirit. Emotionally, I oscillated between anger, sorrow, and determination. The forest had taught me lessons in mortality, resilience, and the fragile boundary between life and death. I mourned the losses, yes, but I also learned to harness grief into vigilance and courage. Every pang of pain, every memory of chaos was a reminder of why we fought, not for glory, but for the fragile hope of freedom, the preservation of human dignity, and the bonds that tied us to each other. In facing these consequences, I began to emerge not just as a survivor, but as someone shaped by the trials, ready for the responsibilities the next missions would demand. After recovering from my injuries, I was entrusted with missions of far greater complexity and responsibility. No longer merely observing enemy movements or relaying basic information, I became a guide for reconnaissance teams, responsible for navigating unfamiliar terrain and delivering critical intelligence under the constant threat, detection. The weight of these assignments pressed heavily on me. Each step I took was laden with the knowledge that a single miscalculation could endanger not just myself, but my comrades and the civilians we sought to protect. The terrain was often unforgiving. Dense forests, steep hills, and flooded valleys challenged every skill I had acquired in training. Every movement required calculated precision, every decision demanded foresight. I learned to read the subtle signs of the environment: broken branches indicating patrol routes, faint trails, marking supply caches, and the distant hum of enemy vehicles to plan our safest and most effective paths. My role required a blend of intuition and meticulous observation honed by the countless missions that had already tested my nerves and judgment. With the increased responsibilities came an acute awareness of leadership. Fellow recruits looked to me for guidance, reassurance, and sometimes even decisions in the heat of uncertainty. I could no longer act solely for myself. The lives of others depended on my ability to remain calm, think critically, and anticipate dangers before they materialized. Mistakes were no longer lessons in theory, they had immediate and tangible consequences. Each success strengthened our unit's cohesion, while each close call reinforced the fragile balance between survival and disaster. Emotionally, these missions shaped a new facet of my identity. The fear that once dominated my thoughts was tempered by confidence born of experience. I discovered resilience not as a concept, but as a practical daily necessity. The forest and the villages became a shared responsibility, their safety intertwined with my decisions and actions. I began to trust not only in my own skills, but in the collective strength of our unit, understanding that coordination, trust, and mutual vigilance were as vital as courage and strategy. Through these new missions, I recognized that my role had transformed. I was no longer an inexperienced recruit shadowing others. I had become an integral part of the resistance, a participant in the broader struggle against depression. Each operation, no matter how small, was a test of skill, judgment, and ethical resolve or preparation for the even greater challenges the war still held in store. By late 1944, the war had reached a critical phase in Bavaria and surrounding regions. The Allied forces were pushing steadily from the west, their advances sending shockwaves through German-occupied territories. Supply lines became increasingly vulnerable, and the occupying army's efforts to maintain control were strained. For our resistance unit, every intelligence report and ambush was no longer an isolated act, but a contribution to the broader unfolding strategic landscape. Each convoy delayed, each patrol disrupted had tangible consequences in the larger conflict. The villagers we protected were acutely aware of these developments. They whispered about increased surveillance, harsher reprisals, and the shifting positions of both enemy and allied forces. Our missions were shaped by these external pressures. A route that had been safe yesterday could become a death trap today, and the information we carried could tip the balance between security and catastrophe. The knowledge of these dynamics made every decision weighty. Each observation, each movement, each decision could influence not only our lives, but also the lives of countless civilians. Our unit adapted accordingly, incorporating intelligence from local informants, monitoring troop movements, and planning operations with the larger Allied offensives in mind. The resistance was no longer reactive. It had become a strategic force subtly shaping the course of local engagements. For me, this integration of broader historical context transformed the way I approached every mission. I was no longer acting solely on instinct or immediate necessity. I was considering long-term implications, patterns of enemy behavior, and the cascading effects of even small actions. This awareness heightened both the pressure and the sense of purpose. Each successful operation felt like a tangible contribution to the broader struggle, a reinforcement of the interconnected web of resistance and allied efforts. Conversely, failures or miscalculations carried greater weight, reminding me of the stakes and the human cost of war. Through these experiences, I came to understand the enormity of the conflict, the intricate web of cause and effect, and the profound responsibility carried by those willing to stand against oppression. The war was not abstract or distant. It was present in every footstep, every decision, and every heartbeat. The relentless pace of missions, the constant vigilance, and the weight of responsibility gradually transformed me. The fear that had once dominated every thought became a measured caution. The adrenaline that had once consumed me now fueled strategic thinking. I began to see my role not just as a participant in skirmishes, but as a contributor to the broader struggle for freedom entrusted with decisions that could shape the lives of those around me. Each success, each survival reinforced my confidence, while every mistake reminded me of the fragility of life and the importance of preparation. Emotionally, I matured rapidly. The brutal lessons of loss, danger, and responsibility instilled in me a profound understanding of courage. It was no longer merely the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with deliberation and conscience despite it. I began to internalize the values my parents had taught me: vigilance, patience, empathy, and the quiet strength that sustains even in the darkest circumstances. Each mission honed not only my skills but my judgment, shaping the way I evaluated risk, weighed moral consequences, and protected those who could not defend themselves. My relationships with fellow recruits also deepened. Trust became sacred. Every glance, gesture, and whispered warning was a lifeline. I learned to rely on others to guide them and to accept their guidance in turn. The camaraderie forged in the crucible of conflict provided a stability amid chaos, a reminder that resilience was as much about shared effort as personal fortitude. Leadership, I realized, was not a title, it was an accumulation of small acts, decisions, and sacrifices that earned the respect and trust of those around you. By the time the next major operation loomed on the horizon, I felt a transformation within myself. I was no longer the frightened girl who had joined the resistance months ago. I was a calculated, cautious, and empathetic fighter, aware of both the stakes and my responsibilities. The war had reshaped my understanding of morality, courage, and human resilience. Every scar, every memory, every success and failure had molded me into someone capable of facing the unknown with clarity, determination, and an unwavering commitment to the cause I had chosen. The journey of growth was neither easy nor complete, but it had instilled a strength I would carry into every challenge that lay ahead. As I grew more capable in the field, I noticed subtle shifts in the way my comrades regarded me. The hesitant glances and quiet caution of my first days had given way to acknowledgement and, in some cases, trust. In the tense moments before a mission, I found myself offering guidance and suggestions, and seeing them acted upon without question was both humbling and affirming. It was not recognition I sought, but the realization that my actions had real weight, that my presence could influence outcomes and safeguard the lives of those around me. The community we protected also became more aware of our efforts. Villagers who had once regarded us with suspicion or fear began to show small signs of appreciation. A discreet nod from a mother whose children we had helped protect, whispered thanks from elders, or the cautious passing of information that aided our operations. It was a silent acknowledgement of our shared struggle, a reminder that our work extended beyond the forest and the missions it was intertwined with the survival and hope of those whose lives were most vulnerable. Within the unit, the bonds we had forged in the crucible of danger strengthened into a mutual respect that transcended age, background, and previous experience. I became a trusted member of the team, someone whose observations and judgment mattered. In return, I relied on them, drawing courage and reassurance from their expertise and steadfastness. Each mission, each moment of peril reinforced the interconnectedness of our survival, the understanding that no one acted alone, and that every success was the product of shared vigilance and trust. This acknowledgement by both comrades and community brought a new layer of responsibility. I could no longer act solely for myself. My choices had consequences for others, and the safety of the team and the villagers depended on my judgment. The weight of this realization was not oppressive but galvanizing. It strengthened my resolve, clarified my purpose, and prepared me for the challenges that lay ahead. I was no longer merely a participant in the resistance. I had become a guardian of the fragile lives and hopes around me, a position that demanded vigilance, courage, and unwavering dedication. By the end of this period, I felt an unmistakable transformation. The girl who had entered the forest timid and uncertain had become a confident, thoughtful, and responsible member of the resistance. The trials, losses, and victories had carved resilience into my very being, and I now understood that the path forward would demand every ounce of skill, courage, and integrity I could summon. The storm of war had shaped me, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The morning the Allied forces entered our region, the forests and hills seemed to hold their breath. From the vantage point of a ridge, I watched the glint of helmets and the march of soldiers moving steadily through the mist. The occupying forces had withdrawn in haste, leaving behind a trail of wreckage, abandoned equipment, and the lingering scent of smoke and burned timber. Relief surged through me, yet it was tempered by the somber reality of the losses we had endured: friends, neighbors, and the innocence of our village torn away by months of conflict. Walking through the streets of my village, I observed homes scarred by fire and artillery, the marketplace reduced to rubble, and the fields that once provided life now trampled and pockmarked. The people emerged cautiously, their faces etched with fear, exhaustion, and cautious hope. Mothers clutched children, close elders exchanged wary glances, and whispers of gratitude for the resistance's efforts floated through the air. I felt a mixture of pride, grief, and relief, understanding that our struggles had contributed to this fragile moment of liberation. Reuniting with my family was an emotional whirlwind. My mother's embrace was both soft and trembling, her tears mingling with relief. My father's stern features softened as he looked into my eyes, silently acknowledging the trials we had survived. Lucas, my brother, grinned shakily, a mix of pride and disbelief in his gaze. The reunion was bittersweet. Though joy flooded through us, the absence of those who had fallen was palpable. Their sacrifices lingered in every scarred building, every burnt tree, and every whispered memory of the lost. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the battered village, I realized that liberation was not a sudden triumph, but a painstaking return to life. The war had left its mark on the land and on the souls of those who endured it. Yet, amidst the rubble and the memories of loss, there was hope, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to carry forward the lessons learned from courage, endurance, and sacrifice. Even as the village began to stir with the cautious rhythms of life returning, the shadows of war lingered within me. My shoulders still throbbed from old wounds, and the aches in my muscles and joints were constant reminders of the battles I had endured. Sleep was elusive. Dreams were haunted by the faces of friends, lost the flash of gunfire and the smoke that had once hung heavy over forests and homes. Each morning I awoke with the same tightness in my chest, a reminder that survival had come at a profound cost. Psychologically, the toll was equally relentless. The memories of those we had lost and the destruction we had witnessed replayed endlessly in my mind. I felt pangs of guilt for having survived, while so many others had not a persistent ache that no amount of rest or time could fully soothe. Sounds, sights, and even scents, crackling fires, distant footsteps, the rustle of leaves could trigger sudden waves of anxiety, pulling me back into moments of fear I thought I had left behind. The war had etched itself deeply into my consciousness, leaving scars invisible but ever present. Yet amidst these struggles, I also began to understand the resilience that had been forged in me. Each pang of pain, each memory of loss had strengthened my resolve to honor those who had sacrificed everything. I realized that survival was not merely physical, it required integrating the emotional and moral lessons of the conflict, accepting both the grief and the growth it had produced. The scars on my body and soul became markers of endurance, proof of the courage and determination that had carried me through the storm. I began to grasp the profound responsibility of memory. My experiences were not mine alone. They were a testament to the countless lives entwined with mine during the conflict. Preserving these memories, honoring the fallen, and learning from the choices we made became as vital as rebuilding the village itself. Though the war had ended, its lessons and burdens would accompany me, always shaping the person I had become and guiding the life I was determined to live in the years to come. Sitting quietly amidst the slowly rebuilding village, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. From the timid girl who first ventured into the forest trembling with fear, to the duelist who had faced bullets, fire, and the loss of friends, the transformation was undeniable. Every trial, every mission, and every sorrow had shaped not only my skills, but my understanding of courage, loyalty, and the profound cost of freedom. I realized that war is not merely a sequence of battles, it is a crucible that tests the limits of the human spirit. It reveals both the darkness and resilience within us, and it forces choices that weigh heavily on conscience and soul. The memories of comrades lost to villages scarred and the lives we touched remained etched in my heart, a constant reminder of the fragility and value of life. Yet, amidst the grief and pain, I found meaning. The bonds forged in adversity, the lessons learned through fear and perseverance, and the moments of courage, both small and great, became a testament to human resilience. My hope is that these experiences, though rooted in suffering, can inspire others to value peace, to cherish life, and to understand the weight of sacrifice. Looking back, I understood that survival was only the beginning. Carrying the memories forward, honoring those who fell, and striving to rebuild not just structures, but trust, compassion, and community, that was the true continuation of the fight. The war had ended, but its lessons would endure, shaping the choices of today and guiding the promise of tomorrow.